I'm reading Philippians 1:12 through 18. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice.
So we're going through the book of Philippians, and those are our verses today. I want to really walk through those verses pretty thoroughly here over the next few minutes. But first, I was thinking about how those verses really give us a claim that's quite astonishing. It's like a claim I heard this week. You know, I think the world could divide probably into two parts. There's those who don't believe in expiration dates when it comes to food, and there's those who are completely scared by, like, even as it gets somewhat close to that expiration date, you're like, like you think as soon as it hits that date, like it just explodes or something, So you've got one camp over here who thinks that expiration date's like, yeah, if it's a week old, what's the big deal? And then you've got this other, again, they're thinking this food item is going to explode when it hits. So here's the astonishing claim when it comes to this. I don't know which side you're on. Maybe we could take a vote, but I heard just recently that there's one food that never expires. Have you ever heard this before? There's one food. Okay, people are shaking their head. What is it? Honey. You got it. Honey never expires. Raw honey, when it's stored properly, never expires. They found some honey in a tomb of a pharaoh, 3,000 years old, and it was still good. Somebody tried it. Somebody pulled it out and was like, I'm just going to see. And it was fine. It was edible. They didn't die. Astonishing. So here's the claim. I just tell that to literally bridge into this claim that is a little harder to swallow than honey. This claim that Paul makes, when you look at these verses, he says that I want you to know, and he's getting into the heart of his message, I want you to know what's actually happened here. And he says that he rejoices. Right at the end, you see him say, I rejoice. Joy is a huge theme of the book of Philippians. In fact, in verse 4, he's already said that he finds joy in the fact that God is doing a work that he will complete. And then at the end of verse 18, he says that he rejoices that the word is advancing, that the gospel is advancing. Now, that's all fine. We would all rejoice over that. But what has preceded that is what makes this an astonishing claim. Paul's astonishing claim in these verses is, I can have joy even when I am suffering. Right? He says, I rejoice even though there's these guys who have preached the gospel, and as they've preached the gospel, they have put me down, they have made light of me, and even in that, I rejoice. He says, I'm in chains right now, but I want you to know that what I'm happy about is that the gospel is advancing. So the big idea here that Paul is saying, this claim he is making in these verses, that's absolutely clear, and it's going to even be made more clear in our verses that we'll get to next week, is that I can have joy in suffering. I'll put it to you another way. This is the way I want to kind of frame this whole message. And it's like this. Put that next slide up. Suffering is never a setback when it serves the gospel. Suffering is never a setback when it serves the gospel. That's what essentially Paul is saying in these verses. And if you don't believe me, because here's the deal. All of us do not like suffering. Last time I checked, no one runs towards suffering. No one looks for it. No one is like, yeah, give me some more of that. You don't go to UGA and take a class on Suffering 101. But in Christianity, there is this class called Suffering 101, because everything about suffering it comes down to this, that it isn't despite of suffering that things happen for the good of our lives and for the good of Christ, but it's actually through suffering in which God works, in which God shows himself, in which he accomplishes the gospel. And that's hard to swallow, right? We just, again, we're gonna, this is a big claim Paul is making. When we're in the middle of suffering, and go ahead and if you're there or you haven't been there recently, you think back to a time when you have been in a place of suffering, and you think, was there any good there? How could good come out of that? But Paul says, if the gospel is advancing through it and God is working through it, then he can have joy and it can actually be good. So if you don't believe me yet, I'm going to talk through all these verses and I'm going to put it under 3 points. The first, the purpose in suffering. Second, the ripple effect of suffering. And third, the joy in suffering. So the purpose, the ripple effect, and the joy in suffering. So we'll talk through each of these. The first, in verses 12 through 13, the purpose in suffering. He says, I want you to know. Paul has, again, exchanged words with this church at Philippi in a way in which he holds them very, very dear. He loves these people, and they love him. And he gets to this part where he says, I want you to know. I just recently wrote a letter, and without even thinking about it, I said, here's what I really want you to know. I literally used that phrase. It kind of sounded like Paul's phrase here. And when I used that phrase, I was moving into a part of the letter where I'm just here's what I got to tell you. And that's what Paul's doing. Very similar to how we would write our letters in that culture, in that day. That phrase, that Greek phrase that's translated, I want you to know, was Paul signifying him saying, there we go, we're getting an alert. Check that out. Make sure we're good. Very distracted very easily. Amber alert. I'm off 100 places. All right, so I want you to know. Paul says, I want you to know. Here's what you've been worried about me. You probably haven't, more than likely, they haven't heard from Paul in 4 years. Is he dead? Is he alive? Is he in prison still? Is he out? What's happened to him? And Paul says, okay, here's what I want you to know. And he says something very interesting. He's basically saying what you think might have been happening hasn't actually been happening. There's more than what meets the eye here. And in my situation, Paul is saying, I want you to know that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. It reminds me of the story of Walt Disney. I love learning about Walt Disney. And with Walt Disney, I'd never heard this before. And he was working on this train in his backyard at one point in his life. I don't know exactly when it was. It was right before the movie Cinderella was going to come out. And he's working on this train, and their studio is actually in very bad shape financially. And they're like, why isn't Walt coming into work? And he's like, well, he's working on this little backyard train, one of those that was like a mini train, that kids would ride on. And everybody around Walt just thought he had lost his mind. It was like, what is he doing right now? This doesn't make any sense. Why is he in his backyard building a train right now? He should be here. He should be helping make sure this movie comes out. He should be making sure we're not going bankrupt. At that point, they really thought Disney was going to go downhill and not going to make it. And there's Walt Disney in his backyard building a train. Didn't make any sense to anyone. And as he finishes and he completes it, he finally comes back. Cinderella ends up being a big hit. And he says, here's the reason I was out there on the train. I had this idea. He said, I have to work in that way. And as I was out there on the train, he said, a vision came to me for this thing I want to call Disneyland. And that's how Disneyland came about, was him working on this train in the backyard. And so when people looked at what was happening, they thought, no, he's lost his mind. He's lost his touch. He's not in this anymore. But what was actually happening was Walt was being Walt Disney. When we look at these verses and we look at Paul and we're like, Paul, you're in prison. What else is there to see? right? Because Paul had all this opportunity in front of him. He had had such a successful ministry. He was going out with the gospel, and everywhere he went, he was able to start new churches. And so if Paul's in prison, he can't start new churches. If Paul's in prison, he can't do the work that God's called him to do. That's what everybody's thinking. God, what's the point of having this guy that we love so much and that has done so much for the kingdom? What's the point of him being in prison right now? It doesn't make any sense. And Paul says, actually, what you think has been happening, there's more that's really happening here that I want you to see. He says, what has actually, some translation says, what has really served, or has rather, it's emphasizing this idea that what you think is happening, actually there's something else happening. And here it is serving to advance the gospel. Paul's suffering is not meaningless if it's serving a greater purpose. That's what he sees here. And that purpose is to advance the gospel. We've called this series in Philippians, Life Defined by Jesus. And these are the verses where this idea arises from. That if your life is so wrapped up in Jesus that you could sit in prison and say, it's a fact I'm in prison, but it's also a fact that the gospel's moving forward, and in that I rejoice. He's saying there's purpose here if the gospel is moving forward. I don't want you to skim past this and you think, well, that's Paul. He's basically a Hall of Fame Christian. If you stop and you put yourself in his shoes, he had every right to be upset about his conditions. He had every right to be mad at God, be angry at God. He's probably chained to a guard 24/7 in a small, confined house, no privacy, no freedom. And again, all of his plans, all the things he wanted to accomplish, it seems like there's no chance of ever seeing those things happen. And again, I think we need to have permission here to move ourselves into the story. When we find ourselves in a place where we're stuck, we're confined, the plans we had have been shut down, the ideas we had, it seemed like there's no way that we're going to see those things accomplished. When we are truly suffering, and we experience suffering, because you will, for us to say, how is it that we respond? What do we do with that? Now, a couple things here. One, Paul is writing this probably a few years into this. He's had time to wrap his mind around this, right? If you had just started walking into some season of suffering, I don't think the expectation is for you immediately to say, yeah, like this is all good, I'm fine, as long as the gospel moves forward. I think Paul had a little time for him to get perspective here and to move into a place where he could say what he's saying here. But ultimately he did. So maybe you felt that way. Again, if you haven't been in a season of suffering, you're headed towards a season of suffering, and I don't like talking about this. I don't like going through this. But in this, we can have hope, and in this, we can have joy, Paul tells us. Scripture shows us that it's okay to speak honestly before God. That's why I love the Psalms so much, that we can go before God and we can say, why, God? Why are you doing this? Where are you at here? But what so often happens in those Psalms is as you cry out to God, and this is why I think God wants us to come before him honestly, is when we cry out to God, that's where he meets us. It's when we stop crying out to God that we have a problem. But when we honestly come before God and we cry out and we tell him, this is where we're at, I feel alone, I feel devastated, God, where are you? In those moments, God meets us there. Sometimes, the moment we shout, God, there's no possible way you could be here, is the very moment in which God is there, most present. So, I read a great line in this commentary with Warren Wiersbe where he challenges us by saying, instead of asking, why is this happening to me? We should ask, how will God use this for his glory? That's tough. It's tough for us to get our heads outside of what's happening in the situation we're in, to move to ask that kind of bigger question. But that's what these verses show us. God, instead of why is this happening to me, God, what are you doing here that could be used for your glory? Genesis 50:20 sticks out to me as well. I always think of that; those numbers really help me for like a call reference to the Bible. You know, you think of 20/20 vision, and Genesis you have 50/20 vision, and it's in Genesis 50:20 where Joseph has said to his brothers, "What you meant for harm for me, God meant for good." If you know the story of Joseph, he gets sold into slavery by his brothers. He's hated by his brothers. And like so much so, you think about family drama. This is some family drama that they act like that he's been murdered. They go and tell his dad a story about him being dead, and they sell him off to slavery. He ends up in Egypt, and when you follow his story in Egypt, it just gets worse. He gets falsely accused. He gets falsely imprisoned. He gets forgotten about in prison, and if anyone has suffered, it's Joseph. His whole from that point on, when he was a teenager and his brothers decided like this is it, we're done with this guy. Moving forward for how many ever years that was, Joseph suffered and suffered and suffered, and it looked like he was going to die in a pit in Egypt, far away from his family. And he has this moment where his brothers come back to Egypt, and he says to them, "As for you, you meant evil for me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." He was able to have that perspective. It's hard to be able to think like that and to have a line like that, like Joseph did. But it's true. Suffering is never a setback when it serves the gospel. Here's one more statement I want to make on when Paul says, here's what's actually happened. This has actually served to advance the gospel. He says, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. Here's another powerful truth. Paul may be in chains, but the gospel isn't. When we're suffering, when we're having a hard time, the gospel doesn't feel that same effect. That's a beautiful thing of how God works, even in the midst of our difficult situations. Charles Spurgeon put it this way: God's servants may be bound, but his truth cannot be fettered. The dungeon may close upon those who preach, but it cannot shut the word in which they have spoken. So that means for us that suffering isn't the end of the story. Even in our hardest moments, God can be working in ways we can't see. So we can find purpose in suffering. And that purpose works its way out in multiple ways. And you see that in this next verse, verse 14. Here's the ripple effect of suffering here in Paul's case. He says that most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So he says, not only has the gospel advanced throughout this whole Praetorian Guard, that's the palace guard, that's the guard that guarded Caesar. He's seeing how him being chained led to that. Not only has that happened, but there's been others who have been emboldened by his faith, by his example. We would think that persecution could make believers shrink back, but often we see the opposite take hold. We would think that Christians might, when they see others suffer, might shrink back and not want to also endure that. But God gives such grace and such power and such hope that in those moments where this suffering occurs, you often see people become emboldened by the gospel. This is a really small example, but it's kind of one of those that's been imprinted in my life. Like literally when I was in middle school, just as a kid, I can't even remember, I was 7th, 8th grade, and there was a new guy to our school. I was a new guy at the school. Here's another new guy at the school. And this guy's name was Chris. Chris became a friend of mine later, but Chris loved Jesus. I was still wrapping my mind around my faith at that age, but I don't know, something about Chris where he just like knew Jesus and loved Jesus even as a middle school kid. And so there would be days Chris always had his Bible at school. He'd show up, and I was like, well, that's pretty cool. He like brings his Bible to school. That's pretty awesome that he likes it that much. And he would show up at school with his Bible, and there'd be days where I would just turn around and he would just be telling someone about Jesus. I'm like, can you do that at school? Is that allowed? He's just like always talking about Jesus. As a middle schooler, I'm just like trying to stay alive, and he's talking about Jesus. Well, that's pretty cool. And then there were times where he really like got out there. I remember in gym class one day, he got a crowd of people around him. He started preaching. Literally, he had the Bible open, and he like starts telling them about Jesus and hell, and it was impressive for a middle schooler to be standing up and like preaching to his peers. He was very bold. And through his boldness, I realized something was happening in me, that his example was emboldening me. I was like, do I believe that? I say I do. I go to church. I'm a middle schooler. Again, I'm still working out my faith. Do I believe that? If so, what does that look like for me? I remember a few times I would bring my Bible to school after that. And I was thinking about how Chris did that for me. Paul says, here I am, I'm preaching the gospel, even though I'm in chains. And what's happened is the church outside has seen that as an example and has said, okay, if Paul's there in prison saying, like, this is okay, and in fact, God is working here, not despite this, but in this, we're going to follow in the same way. That's the ripple effect of suffering. When you in suffering and you choose to say, God, it's not what I'm having to face, it's God about what you're doing, then that will ripple effect out to others when that happens. James Montgomery Boyce says it like this. It's one of the paradoxes. Sorry, I lost my place. It's one of the paradoxes of Christian history that the very things that have seemed most to shackle the gospel have actually turned out to advance it. The imprisonment of Paul should have terrified the believers into silence. Instead, it had the reverse effect. They saw Paul's joy and commitment, even in suffering, and they concluded that if the gospel is that powerful, it is worth proclaiming no matter the cost. So, suffering is never a setback when it serves the gospel. History has repeatedly shown that the church thrives, not when the circumstances are in its favor the greatest, but when the odds are most stacked against it. Have you ever seen that? You think about China. In communist China, there was, when the communist takeover took place in 1949, there were about 4 million Christians. And even with the expulsion of missionaries and the church being forced underground, today that number is over 100 million believers in China. Isn't that amazing? Do you know where the gospel is growing the fastest right now in the world? You heard that? It's in Iran. Right now, the greatest gospel movement is happening in Iran by everyone who's like kind of keeping track of those kind of things. And where the persecution is the hardest and the greatest, the gospel is advancing the most. It's just like a fact and a truth about the gospel. And Paul's realizing, and that's what he's sharing with us, that suffering is never a setback when it serves the gospel, and that you can find purpose in it, and that there's a ripple effect that happens, and that the gospel advances not just despite suffering, but through it. And finally, he says there's actually joy in it as well. I mean, this is a fascinating observation, like I said, that he recognizes that since his imprisonment, others have risen up to preach Christ, but not all of them have had pure motives. Some have preached out of envy and rivalry. So this is a little misunderstanding. I want to make sure we're all clear on this. I think it's a good teaching point for all of us that we want to believe that if you were to walk into any church and whoever was up there talking somehow was like a super Christian, and that they had the most pure motives and motivations, and holiness was a chief characteristic of their life. But as you know, that's not the case. All of us Anyone who stands up to preach the gospel needs to do so in such humility, understanding how fallible they are, right? And this is especially true in how people have been hurt in the church. Because at times we put so much stock in that person who's preaching, believing that like I know they've got their act together, and then when they fail, it hurts us, right? I know because this has happened to me. I know this because I've experienced this, that there's people that I've known in my life who've proclaimed Christ, who've stood up, who I thought, man, they love Jesus. They are for me. They are for others. And then I find out that everything happening outside of that does not match up at all. And that's hard to fathom. But Paul says there are preachers who are doing so out of wrong motivation. And we're going to be tempted to say, well, if they failed and I was like a part of their ministry and like I was so impacted by them, what does that mean for me? And the truth of what he's saying here is that they didn't convert you. They didn't grow you. The gospel converted you. The gospel grew you. Even if it was through someone who had motivations such as envy or rivalry. He says, what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. For Paul specifically, these are people who in some form or fashion are out against him. So he's personally feeling the burn here. But he says, what I think is most important is that Christ is proclaimed. Again, this is a pretty astonishing claim that he says even when they're preaching with these wrong motives and interiorly they're not the same, it's not matching up. He says, what I am excited about is that Christ is proclaimed. The NIV commentary explains it well, I think. He says this, Paul was at peace with his circumstances despite his unjust imprisonment and the presence of fellow believers who took advantage of his suffering to advance their own selfish ambitions. And he says, the reason for this remarkable attitude was that the advancement of the gospel was his primary goal in life. So if we have a hard time like wrapping our minds around that and getting to that place, then that's probably because the gospel is not the primary goal of our life. And that's why we're reading this book in Philippians is we're asking God to move us to a place where the gospel is the primary goal in our life, where what Jesus wants to do is better than what I want to do. And he says, in this, I rejoice. Now, what does he mean by rejoicing in this? What is this joy that he's talking about? Because I don't think it's joy where Paul says, like, I'm going to go looking for suffering. He's not saying, like, I'm going to seek this out because this is, like, good. This is, like, somehow, like you would seek out a healthy diet. I'm going to go seek out suffering. But he says this, this is how I would understand it, that joy is a settled peace that arises when the gospel becomes the focus of your life, no matter what circumstances come your way. It's a settled peace that arises when the gospel is the focus of your life. Joy is a peace that says, I know I can have happiness in God even when my situation is not happy. Because I'm at peace that God's doing something here greater and bigger and stronger and better than I could on my own, or even in good circumstances. Here's the ultimate proof. The ultimate proof for this is the core message of the gospel, right? That's the ultimate for us. That when we think, Jesus, you're on the cross and you're dying, this doesn't make any sense. How is that going to accomplish anything? And Jesus says, suffering is not a setback in this case. In fact, it's through suffering in which I will accomplish my purposes. That's the message of the gospel, is that it's through suffering that God accomplishes his purposes. Suffering is never a setback when it serves the gospel. I'll be honest, I preached these verses before, and I look back at my notes when I've taught through Philippians, and I usually manuscript out my messages, so I went back and I looked at my message for this, and it was fine. It was like my whole message was completely different. I didn't take one word from that message though. I look back at that message, it was fine. It taught the basic idea of what's happening here in this chapter. But it was really missing one key piece, because that was a long time ago that I wrote that message, a long time before I experienced, in my opinion, in my life, a lot of suffering over the last decade or so. And in that suffering, by experience, I've come to agree with Paul. And I've come to understand that the gospel really gives us that pattern to follow. That's in suffering, in which God shows us that it doesn't have to be a setback. We don't have to, we're usually going to try to do a couple things. We're going to try to just get through it as fast as possible and just try to ignore all the bad parts as much as possible. We're just going to pin it down as much as possible. Or we can go into complete despair. And the gospel doesn't let us go either direction. The gospel lets us see what's fully in front of us. The gospel lets us understand that it's not good. It's not what God intended. It's not at all what he would want for our lives, but in it, he works. Romans 8:28 is kind of the equivalent of Genesis 50:20. It's the New Testament equivalent where we're told that God works together for the good of those who love him, who've called according to his purposes. He works together for his glory and our good, all things. And so these verses lead us to a place where we can come to an agreement that suffering is never a setback when it serves the gospel. When Paul makes this astonishing claim that you can have joy in suffering, I think you can. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that it won't always come right at the beginning, but in knowing this truth, you can agree with it and you can live it, and you will see how God works in it.